Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I've got Todd Hirsch with us tonight. I've had the pleasure of interviewing him before. He's a Calgary-based expert on economics, a speaker, and a very smart, articulate, written guy. Todd has written a bunch of late on what's going on with our economy and with Trump and trade wars and things like that. Your most recent one, Todd, was good news. We're headed for a global recession. But unlike other recessions, this one is self-induced, created only by ego, lust for power, and stupidity. And then you say, so why is this good news? So Todd, why is this good news? Please.
Well, it was maybe a bit of a harsh, a harsh critique. I don't know. I just started with the good news, mostly because we're just being inundated with bad news. Now, in a practical sense, of course, a recession is not good news at all. This is going to be quite painful. People will lose their jobs. Businesses will fail. People will foreclose on mortgages. So I don't want to, be trite about this. But, I use the good news, we're headed for a recession, as kind of the heading, mostly to catch eyeballs, but then also to redirect people to the idea that, never waste a good crisis. A recession can be a useful time to reset some priorities. As individuals, we can take stock of what's really important in our lives. Look back 5 years ago when COVID hit. That was a very different and unique kind of recession. But just the nature of that pandemic, I think, while none of us want to repeat it, I think everyone would, admit that they did have some time to sit and think about what was important in their lives. Economics and businesses and jobs come and go, but what do we really, truly value in our lives? And that's where it gets down to human connection.
So you say, I frankly agree with you. I think we all had that sort of forced time out, and we did take a chance for that. That said, I think there were a lot of people that really missed the human connection. And I'm thinking the most of, frankly, high school students and university students that didn't have student clubs or the economics club or the football team or the homecoming gala or, whatever. And so I think that really cost people, a lot of that social development and social interaction. Anyway, you said that whatever party wins the election, which is happening in the next 2 weeks, we will get change. What type of change are you looking for, sir?
I'm looking for change from either party, and I'm hearing whiffs of it in the campaign of both leaders. And what I'm looking for is a shift that refocuses our government's attention on the economy. I think that is something that has been lost. And I don't want to lay all of this at the feet of Justin Trudeau. I think it's been lost for a while, and I think it's been lost on premiers across the country as well. For whatever reasons, the pandemic might have had something to do with it, but our focus as governments, or government's focus, has allowed to drift away from managing the economy really well. Now, to be fair, there are other priorities that they have to pay attention to, social justice, things around diversity, equity, inclusion. All those things are important, 100%. But we allowed ourselves and our governments to become so that their attention has become so diverted away from managing the economy that Canada, we find ourselves a bit lazy, a bit fat and complacent. I don't mean individuals, and I don't mean individual businesses. I just mean as a country, as a national economy, we've become a bit complacent. And this tariff threat was an enormous wake-up call that was very unpleasant and is going to be unpleasant. We'll see what happens in the next 90 days. But it's been a wake-up call. And I think what I'd like to see, to get back to your original question, I'd like to see our new federal government, be it the Conservatives or the Liberals under a new leader, refocus some attention on economic management, because I think that's what's been missing.
So you're coming to us from Calgary, and you are obviously extremely knowledgeable about what's going on in Alberta and the oil and gas economy. Daniel Smith has supposedly given Mark Carney a list of 8 demands, and if he doesn't meet those 8 demands, if he becomes prime minister or a new prime minister, if not Mark Carney, comes to power, they've got to meet those 8 demands, which include a lot of things in regards to oil and gas. But also, I understand that you got to get rid of the restriction on plastic straws and paper straws, and bring back plastic straws, and then Preston Manning has said a vote for Mark Carney is a vote for Alberta separation. What do you think of those two people's arguments?
Yeah, I think it's unfortunate, to be honest. When I look at Premier Smith's 8 demands, most of them actually are kind of reasonable. I don't know about the plastic straw thing. I think pardon the pun, she's grasping at straws on that one. But, some of these demands, in quotes, I think are fairly reasonable. It's the timing of all of this that is a bit awkward for me. There is a time to make demands, or at least sit down with whoever is going to be the new prime minister and say, hey, look, we've got some real issues in Alberta that are holding us back. We do feel like we've been a bit neglected and a bit maybe ignored here in Alberta. And here's 8 points that we would like to address with you. I think there's a time for that. But for her, and then for Preston Manning to stir up constitutional crises, which in this instance, I mean, we all know what we're talking about. They are fanning the flames of Western alienation and separatism here in Alberta, which is not particularly strong at the moment. But like we've seen in Quebec, these embers can be, they can flare up into something a little more dangerous. I think the timing of all this is really disappointing. I think there's maybe a time for those conversations. But right now, when we are facing an existential threat as a country, we have an aggressive president in the White House who keeps talking about annexing us. There is a time for constitutional crises. And then there is a time where we need all hands on deck, all 13 premiers and the federal government rowing in the same direction, on the same message. We can deal with the 8 demands at a later date, but right now I really think we need to be all on Team Canada. So I'm a bit disappointed with Premier Smith's approach, and Preston Manning, to be honest, I have a lot of respect for that man, but I just am confused and dumbfounded why at this moment he would write that op-ed.
You mentioned, threats of becoming the 51st state. Supposedly there's something like 18 to 20% of Albertans that actually would agree with wanting to join the United States.
I guess they're out there somewhere. I mean, I've lived my whole life in Alberta. I don't know. I mean, there's no way a fifth of the people I know want to do that. I think maybe people respond differently in a poll when they know it doesn't mean anything than if they were actually at a voting booth and now it's a referendum. Do we want to join the US or not? Because of our energy sector, we have more Americans here in Alberta proportionately than any other province. So that might have something to do with it. It might be those Americans who are expats now living here in Alberta and living in Calgary who say, yeah, actually, that wouldn't be a bad idea. But by and large, I don't know where the polling numbers come from. I think that 18% might be a bit of a frustration vote. I really have a hard time believing, and this is outside my area of expertise, but I have a hard time believing almost 1 in 5 Albertans want to join the United States. I just don't see it.
You were quoted at length in a really interesting article in the Globe and Mail about a week ago in regards to sort of the whole history of Canada-U.S. relations from an economic and tariff standpoint. I want to take a break for some messages and come back and wonder, Todd, if you could sort of give us a sense of where we are in that history of reciprocity, free trade, tariffs, et cetera, between Canada and the United States, and where you think we are going and should go. Stay with us, everyone. We're going to come back in 2 minutes with Todd Hirsch talking about sort of the history of free trade and what he thinks needs to happen now. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio. I've got Todd Hirsch with me. He's coming from Calgary. He's a Calgary-based economics analyzer, writer, etc. He's a keynote speaker. He's an author, a commentator, and a very, very smart gentleman. And so it's a real pleasure to, Todd, have you on my show again. I really appreciate you joining us. We've just talked a little bit about where we are from a Alberta in the election campaign and in Canada standpoint. Now I want to turn to where Canada is in regards to our economic relations with the United States. In this article, you did not write it, but you were quoted extensively in it that I'm referring to. That was Canada stands at a crossroads as Trump enacts shattering policies, and you talked through sort of the history of free trade, reciprocity, with the United States and where we are and where we're going. We had Laurier back, when was it, in the 1920s, that lost an election in Canada arguing for free trade reciprocity with the United States. And then, famously in 1988, we had the free trade election. And I remember forever John Turner saying to Brian Mulroney in that debate, you're giving up our our economic sovereignty. And if you give up our economic sovereignty first, eventually comes our political sovereignty. And given that we're now talking about, 51st state, wipe out the invisible line, economic integration, political integration, annexation, etc. Where are we? Have we become so integrated that our economy is completely dependent on the United States and Trump can do with us as he wishes? What do you think?
Well, I mean, it's a great question, and there's a lot to unpack in what's happened in the last 40 years or so of free trade. And I think a lot of listeners, I shouldn't assume everyone, probably half of them weren't even born at the time of the 1988 election around free trade. But I remember being an economics student at the University of Alberta at the time when the country was embroiled in this debate over free trade with the United States. And yeah, it felt like a lot hung in the balance. Now, maybe because I was an economics student and maybe because I was, at least at the time, a little bit more libertarian in my approach, as young people tend to be. I was very much in favor of free trade and, supportive of Brian Mulroney and the PC party at that point, who was, promoting it. But, there were all these arguments against it, all these dire predictions of, like you said, we're going to be taken over. I remember these, predictions that within months, our healthcare system will be dismantled, the CBC will be gone, hockey will be eliminated, they're going to kill Anne Murray, like all these wild sort of, it got really.
No one ever suggested the death of Anne Murray. Come on, give me a break.
Well, it was all around Canadian culture, and it's going to be dead on arrival the minute, we engage in free trade. And then, free trade happened, and none of those things happened at all. In fact, if anything, I would argue that Canadian culture maybe became a little bit stronger. Maybe it was because we were a bit more conscious in Canada of what nationhood means and what Canadian culture means and what it means to identify as Canadian. I don't know. Those are for other smarter people than me to unpack what happened. But what did happen is that the North American economy, it did integrate. And then, of course, in 1992, Mexico joined. So it became NAFTA. And for 30 years, NAFTA was really held up around the world as, this is the envy of the world, to be involved in a free trade agreement with the world's largest and most powerful economy. And it really did help the Canadian economy. Now, to be sure, there are always industries that are winners and then some that are not winners. And we did see some adjustments. We saw that in the United States as well. So I don't want to make it sound like everybody came out ahead right away. But by and large, it really was a boost to the Canadian and US economies. What ended up happening, though, is, you might want to argue that Canada's road to complacency started in 1989 when we engaged in free trade with the United States, because it was a benefit to us, but it also allowed us to be a little bit complacent, because for the last 40 years, anything we would, dig out of the ground or chop down or grow or manufacture, we would sell into the US market unfettered. And now that, sort of surprising everybody, that rug has been pulled out from under our feet. And now we don't have that, or at least the threat that we're not going to have that. And we've seen steel, aluminum, autos, already facing those tariffs. So while I would argue that it has been an enormous economic benefit, it also has put us in this, it's allowed us ourselves to be painted into a bit of a corner. And now it's a bit awkward as we're facing the realities of just how dependent we are on one single market.
So, back in the 1970s, Pierre Trudeau, Prime Minister at the time, was talking about we need a third alternative and we need to diversify away from reliance on the United States. Hasn't happened. Something like 50-70% of all of our production is exported, and something like 75 or 85% of that goes to the United States. So we are very reliant on trade, and very reliant on trade with the United States. What hope and heck have we got of becoming less reliant on the United States?
Well, it's going to take some effort. Now, I would, credit different federal governments over the last couple of decades, because those free trade agreements with Europe, with parts of Asia, there's different countries, governments, I think, have done the heavy lifting in creating that framework. We have a free trade agreement, the CETA, with the European Union. That's the government's job. Now, it's business's job to actually act on that. The challenge, though, is that up until the last 6 months or so, it's still been far easier and far more lucrative and profitable to just continue selling into the US market. So it's hard to really assign any blame. Like when people say, shouldn't we diversify our trade? Well, who is the we in that sentence, that pronoun? Shouldn't we? Who is that? Does it mean the governments, the federal government? I think they've done some work in laying the groundwork for free trade. Does it mean businesses? Well, if you're a business and you are focused on your bottom line or return to your shareholders, obviously you're going to do what makes the most economic sense, and that is sell into the US market. So it's hard to assign blame, but now we found that the tables have shifted on us. Selling into Europe, Japan, South Korea, other reliable trading partners, I think that's a great option. The problem with that is, these relationships take years to build. We don't have, at the moment, a lot of the infrastructure that we need. And here I'm talking like actual physical infrastructure, pipelines, adequate port facilities, rail, everything else. It's much, much harder to send, a barrel of oil to Europe or Japan, when in fact we've got the infrastructure right now set up selling it into the US. So it is going to take some effort on all parts, the business community particularly, if we are going to diversify our trade. That it's a long game. This is not something that we can just snap our fingers and by summer of 2025 say, there, we're diversified. It is going to take a while for us.
So I want to come back in a couple minutes and chat about infrastructure you think that we need to put in place. But let's go back to your comments, if I could, about NAFTA or CUSMA or MUSA or whatever it's called today, because everyone seems to have a different name for it, depending on which letter comes first in the definition. But you say that it's been beneficial to Canada and the United States. Trump says he got ripped off. What do you think the truth is?
I would love to actually get into Donald Trump's brain. He believes somehow, at least if we can, take what he says as what he's thinking. And even that's a question mark. But he says, because we've got a deficit with Canada in goods, the United States buys more goods from Canada than we buy from them. He believes this deficit is somehow an indication of their being ripped off. He does not really understand how trade between two countries works. Just because they're buying more from us, that really just means they are a richer and wealthier and more powerful economy than we are. And if you would add into it services, which people have been pointing this out. I don't know why he doesn't understand this. But if you look at goods and services. So how much Netflix Canadians watch, how much, tourism, which is really a service, Canadians engage in the US, goods and services, it's pretty much balanced. So his whole thing with we're being ripped off, I really don't understand it. He seems to just be looking at the deficit in trading goods. That is not an indication of anyone being ripped off. And by the way, I'm sure he's been reminded by many people, he was the last author on the last, Kuzma reboot back when in his first term, he was holding the pen on the agreement. And at the time, he said it's the greatest trade agreement of all time. And now 6 years later, they're being ripped off. So,
well, and now 6 years later, you're saying who was the dummy that inked that agreement?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think everyone understands there's a lot more nuance going on. He is trying to create an American economy that is protectionist, that, very unfortunately, he tends to view everybody outside of the United States as opponents, which is a shift in tone for a president. Everyone is adversarial. I think that must come from his background as a real estate, mogul, where there's a buyer and a seller, and it's a zero-sum game. It would be nice if he would view the rest of the world, or the free world anyway, liberal democracies, as partners rather than adversaries and opponents. But this is the situation we're in.
Well, it looks like he missed out on that course in Econ 101 about the theory of comparative advantage.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about NAFTA or Kuzma or whatever. What about globalization? I, in my day job, do business in the United States, and we can't find employees. That's the biggest issue that company after company raise. I spent some time recently in a couple of cities along I-65, and they were talking about how I-65 had become the logistics corridor in the United States, taken over from I-75, and I-65 goes from Chicago down to Birmingham, Alabama, going through St. Louis and Indianapolis and Memphis and things like that. And they've got massive Amazon warehouses and DHL landing several flights a day from China and from Europe, bringing goods into the United States. And yet people talk about how we've lost all these jobs, how we need manufacturing back, about how globalists are wrong. What's the truth? Has global trade destroyed the American heartland, or has it helped America?
Well, I think, it is true that a lot of those jobs in the 80s and 90s that were, these manufacturing jobs that back in the 60s and 70s were really good paying jobs. Those jobs did shift to Asia, but what also happened is that all those jobs became automated. So even if, and I think this is what Donald Trump, at least this is what he says he's trying to do, even if all these big companies reestablish manufacturing hubs in the United States, it's not going to bring back a lot of jobs. It'll bring back maybe construction jobs and, while they're building all these plants and facilities, but so much of manufacturing is automated. It's robotics. So I think what he's trying to do, when he says we're going to bring back these jobs, I think this is not about economics. This is about nostalgia, and this is about getting reelected. He told people that, West Virginia can be a great, mighty economic power once again, like it was in the 60s and 70s. And, there are a lot of people in those parts of the Appalachians in the United States, and in Canada for that matter too, whose skills have not been able to keep up with the global economy. Their skills back in the 60s and 70s might have been suited for a job on a shop floor in a manufacturing facility, but they're not as well suited for a world of robotics, artificial intelligence, and global telecommunications. Those skill sets are different. But I guess to your original question, where are all these workers going to come from? I mean, the United States has 3% unemployment, even if they were to bring
out
back
all the
these
illegal
manufacturing
aliens.
jobs. Yeah, it's not that the country is, facing 12% unemployment and we could put millions of people back to work. This would create labor shortages like we've never seen in the United States. So there's a lot of economic holes in everything that's going on right now.
So what's going to happen?
What is going to happen? I've always said, people always ask me, Todd, you're the economist. Get out the crystal ball and tell us what's going to happen. And I always say, well, the crystal ball these days is more of a lava lamp. In other words, I've got some things I can peer into. I've got some data and what's happening right now. But things are changing and morphing so quickly that predicting what's going to happen is really a fool's game in 2025. And it has been for a while. And I think Donald Trump and his, erratic style of, announcing things sort of out of the blue, catching everybody, including his cabinet, completely off guard. It sort of underscores that this question, what's going to happen? How can we forecast in this environment? It's almost useless. These days, I've been more helping people and audiences understand, what do I need to do to prepare for any outcome? Because that question, what's going to happen, we just don't know.
It comes back to the control the things that you can control. One thing that happened last week that I'd really like you to help us understand is this movement in the bond market. So maybe we could take a break for some messages and come back and talk to our expert, Todd Hirsch, about what actually made Trump change policies last week. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I've got Calgary-based economist Todd Hirsch with us tonight. He's formerly with a financial institution. He now is a keynote speaker and an author and a commentator about what's going on from an economic standpoint. And Todd, maybe you can help us. Some people thought that Trump changed his mind because of the stock market decline, but then other people said that what really happened is the bond market moving and people internationally selling U.S. government bonds. Can you explain to the uneducated what actually happened with the bond market last week?
Well, it's a really great question, and a lot of educated economists are still scratching our heads trying to figure out, what is the dynamic that's going on. So there are broadly, two ways people invest, generally speaking. Either equities, the stock markets, you buy stocks in a company like Walmart or 3M or Boeing, or you put money in government bonds, which tends to be a little bit more secure. And the two generally move back and forth. If in times of economic insecurity, people will put more money in government bonds, which reduces the yield on the bond. The price of the bond goes up, but the yield goes down. The borrowing cost goes down.
The interest rate.
In better, more stable, optimistic economic times, people will move out of bonds into equities and the stock markets. That tends to depress the price of the bonds, but it increases the yield. In other words, borrowing costs then go up. But what we're starting to see is that sort of breakdown, as it does from time to time, where, stock market volatility and people bailing out of stocks did not result in people moving into the bond market, which drives interest rates down. So what we saw last week is a lot of volatility. We saw the stock market, up and down, but a lot of days, big bailouts on the stock markets with prices falling. At the same time, which doesn't happen often, we also saw people moving out of the bond market, which moved those interest rates higher, which is exactly what Donald Trump does not want. There is kind of a theory out there that Donald Trump, sort of wants to depress the stock market in order to reduce interest rates. It might force the U.S. Federal Reserve to lower interest rates. Also, that bond market we talked about, interest rates there would maybe narrow because people buying more bonds. But that's not happening right now. So if that was his grand scheme, it's not working out as he was hoping.
Some people thought it wasn't the same people in the United States that were, selling the stock market equities and selling the bonds, that it was foreigners, China and the EU that were getting out of U.S. dollar bonds. And the proof of that is that most European currencies, Asian currencies, and even Canada has appreciated relative to the U.S. dollar over the course of the last several weeks. What do you think of that? Does that make any sense?
It does make some sense. The largest shareholder of US debt, of US government debt, is China. Now, this is where it gets really interesting because China is pretty careful and very cautious about how much information it releases. We don't really have a great idea of if it was China pulling out of US government bonds as a way of maybe punishing the United States. Hard to know how some of these political games translate into economic actions. But, there is a theory or maybe a suggestion that maybe it's China pulling out of US government bonds as a way of driving up interest rates in the United States, because the two at the moment are embroiled in a trade war. So I think there is some credibility to that notion that some of this anyway of this bailing out of the U.S. bond market could be actions by China, but I don't think it's solely that. I do think that other holders of U.S. government debt are also looking for other places to park money, simply because it was always the case that the U.S. economy is sort of king. And in times of instability, you buy US dollars. That too, these days, is now a questionable proposition.
How could you argue the United States' stability? When the president changes his strategy every couple of days.
Absolutely. And this is uncharted territory for anyone. We've had interesting characters in the White House before, but we've never seen this kind of wild instability and unpredictability. And that, I think, could be sort of challenging the US dollar's dominance in the global economy and by currency traders. And then they might be looking at other currencies that, like the euro or the Canadian dollar or the Australian dollar, other currencies that tend to get sideswiped, in fact, during times of economic instability. But these days, all the rules, everything is changing. And now maybe the US dollar does not look like it is the kingpin it used to be.
So, Todd, if I could, let me ask you a question. Why wouldn't China sell their holdings of U.S. bonds, given the current situation? Maybe you can explain why they would have them. I understand the reason why they have them is because they had this massive surplus with trade with the United States, and so therefore they ended up, having to put that cash somewhere, and the logical place is in the U.S. bonds. And in addition, to not do so, to keep it in their own currency, would mean their own currency would appreciate it. And if they had this export-driven sort of economy, keeping the Chinese currency low makes sense. But given this current situation where they've got this massive tariffs of 145% or something like this put on them, the currency going up by a couple of points isn't going to negatively impact them. Why wouldn't they sell all those U.S. bonds, discipline Donald Trump, and put it into either their own currency or into Euro bonds? Why would that makes a lot of sense to me, doesn't it?
Well, it's a great question. I guess the other part of the equation is they can pull it out, but they're going to park it then somewhere. So do you park it back at home and, drive up the value of the Chinese currency? Are there enough places around the world, Europe, maybe even Canada, to park it? This might be why we're starting to see some of these other currencies appreciate a little bit. But it's a great question. I'm out of my pay category when it comes to, what the government of China is doing in the bond market. I would leave that for a lot smarter people. But I do think, again, politics bleeds into finance and economics. And there could be a political motivation in China that is driving them to sell U.S. Government bonds, even if economically or financially that might not be the very best approach. But like I always say, there's a political answer and there's an economic answer. And very often politics will trump the two.
You've been a critic of debt and deficits in the past. This big, beautiful bill that was passed by the U.S. Congress this past week is going to have substantial tax decreases and is going to add to the deficit in that regard. Is looking for a huge amount of saving, and Elon Musk is saying he's only identified like 10-15% of the targeted savings so far, and some people think even that's not real. And so most people think, and they're increasing the debt limit. So most people think this is going to add to a debt in the United States that's already something like on an annual basis, 5 times as a percentage of GDP, the level of deficit in Canada. Is this sustainable? What's that going to do to the U.S.?
That's another great question. If you would have asked me this a few years ago, I would have said the US economy is so large and so powerful that if we think about it, how a lot of us would have a limit on our credit card, the US borrowing limit is still so far into the future that they need to pay attention, but they don't need to panic. The US government can continue borrowing for a long time before it reaches levels like we saw in Greece about a decade ago, where in fact the country becomes insolvent. The US, not there. However, the conversation today is different because that credit limit for the US might be shortening. Like we were just talking about, people now looking at the United States and saying, is it really the safest bet? Is the US dollar really as stable and secure? Is that really where I want to be in times of crisis? I don't know anymore because of who's driving who's steering the ship in the White House. So I would say that today the deficit and debt situation for the U.S. now becomes, I think, a more interesting and maybe a bit more frightening proposition. I don't think the U.S. has the same debt credit card limit as it used to have. It could be butting up against that. And also what I'm not seeing is any credible plan to turn this deficit and debt situation around.
You mentioned a couple minutes ago that you think we've become complacent in Canada, that with the free trade agreements, we've not had to do the things that we need to do, and that one of the things we need to do is invest in infrastructure. People have talked about pipelines, they've talked about power grids, they've talked about high-speed rail. What are your recommendations? What should a new government, whoever that government might be thinking about in regards to the Canadian economy?
Well, maybe I'm a bit biased because I live in downtown Calgary. And, I consider myself an environmentalist and a practicalist as well. Pragmatic view of looking at the Canadian economy. And the reality is our number one export and our largest resource by far is energy. And we have become complacent in Canada with our political inability to build more pipeline infrastructure across the country. And I know it's a complicated debate and topic, and I understand it. But when you see most provinces across the country, notably British Columbia and Quebec, just kind of putting, their stake in the ground and saying, we are not going to allow any pipelines to our territory. I think that is the kind of short-sighted complacency that has now painted us into a corner in Canada because we can't get our most valuable resource to seawater, not much of it anyway. I mean, there's the pipeline now to the West Coast, the expansion. But we really should have been expanding our pipeline capacity over the last 20 years to the point where we have diversified our trading partners. The situation has gone the other way, where it's been almost impossible for the private sector to build any pipeline simply because of the risk, the political opposition. Nobody wants this pipeline. And I understand it. I really do. I don't want to minimize, the environmental concerns around it because I think those are real and we need to pay attention to that. But I do think that this wake-up call, now, we're hearing the premiers of provinces like Quebec and British Columbia saying, well, maybe we need to rethink these pipelines because even they have realized, wow, this has put our country in a terrible position.
So Northern Gateway, which I think goes from Alberta to the Pacific Coast, should it be built?
Yeah. I'm not a pipeline expert. That one, I think the federal government killed it, and I know there was a lot of anger and disappointment here in Alberta when they killed that one. I think it had to do with, it had to traverse so much difficult and very sensitive terrain, and also the port. It was at port, the Douglas channel at the port of Kitimat, if I recall. And there were just concerns about, do we really want big oil tankers in and out of that particular channel because of the environmental sensitivity? That's the way I remember the debate going, and that's why it was killed. I don't know if it was the right thing or not to kill it. I don't think we should just, build infrastructure and pipelines anywhere. I still have enough, common sense around the sensitivities to our planet and to our physical environment that we do need to pay attention. Like, can we build these things in a way that mitigates environmental damage, or at least the potential threat of environmental damage? I think we can do that. I think we need to be maybe a bit more intentional about it. But the Northern Gateway project, I think that one was maybe doomed from the start.
Most of the oil and gas, I understand, that comes to Ontario comes through Michigan, and a lot of the oil that's bought in New Brunswick comes from the United States. Does it make sense for us to have our pipelines go through the United States or be reliant on the United States?
Well, not anymore. Back in the day when, this is a 100% guaranteed reliable trade relationship with the United States, it made more sense for that, to have an integrated Canada-US oil pipeline transmission and refining network. Because it didn't really matter where it flowed, across the border and then back up into Ontario for refining at Sarnia. But now, again, everything has shifted. And now it would be really great, in fact, if we had pipelines that were more contiguous throughout Canada, so that we could ship Western Canadian oil to refineries in Ontario and New Brunswick without going through the United States. But that's a 10-year plan. We're way behind. There really hasn't been a strong enough incentive to do that. There's been a lot of political opposition. So we just sort of complacently went along with the system the way it was, with Western Canadian oil flowing through the U.S. Midwest and then back into Canada. And now we're finding out, this is a terrible spot that we painted ourselves into.
I saw power grid maps that showed that Alberta, British Columbia are tied in with Oregon and Washington and Montana, and that Ontario, Quebec, and Upper New York State, Vermont, New Hampshire are all fairly tied in. But there's nothing from a power grid standpoint that ties Eastern Canada versus Western Canada together. Does that make sense?
Economically, it does make sense. Politically, no. So economically, because we are this very thin population spread across, from the Atlantic to the Pacific, it is natural that more of our economic flow is going to be north-south rather than east-west, especially when you've got between Winnipeg and Sudbury, with apologies to people in Thunder Bay, like almost no one lives in that massive corridor. It's mostly trees and moose. So economically, it has always sort of made more sense that we trade more north-south, that the power grids would go north-south into Vermont and into Oregon and Washington. But now we find ourselves where those the politics of all this has shifted it, and the economics, even though it maybe made more sense in the past, economically, it would be great if we had more east-west power corridors, pipeline corridors that sort of unify and bring our provincial economies more tightly in line.
So you've talked about our complacency. You've talked about infrastructure, and you've admitted that there's some challenges from an environmental standpoint, political standpoint, and time standpoint in actually getting some of those investments done in infrastructure. The one thing we haven't talked about is interprovincial trade barriers. So I want to take a break and come back and ask you whether that's one of the potential solutions to our current situation. Stay with us, everyone. We'll be back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone. We've got Todd Hirsch, a smart economist from Calgary, and a keynote speaker and a commentator, an article writer, etc., with us tonight. Todd, we've talked about free trade. We've talked about the history of tariffs. We've talked about Donald Trump. We've talked about infrastructure. We've talked about a lot of stuff. What about interprovincial trade barriers? Lots of people say that that's a solution, but that it's not tariffs, it's non-tariff barriers. What gives there, and is that a potential solution?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, I've been around so long. One of my very first jobs as an economist when I was just out of grad school. So this is 1992, like 33 years ago. I choked to even say that. But 1992, I worked here in Calgary for a not-for-profit research group called the Canada West Foundation, which at the time was helping facilitate a meeting of the premiers and the prime minister around breaking down barriers to interprovincial trade. And the result was the Agreement on Internal Trade, the AIT. And it was fantastic. And there were lots of handshakes by the premiers and lots of photo ops. And it was great and a lot of fanfare. And then all the premiers went back to their respective capitals and nothing happened. And the reason nothing happened is that while an agreement on interprovincial trade sounded good, there were a lot of special interest groups and unions and industry associations in those provinces that had a lot to lose if, in fact, we flung open the doors and liberalized trade across the provinces. Every one of them has their own little empire, their own little fiefdom, and it was in their interest to lobby their premiers to say, well, we like, interprovincial trade, but in our case, we do need a special provision. We do need special protection because, some of our members might be at risk. And then everything sort of collapsed and very little of that, of the agreement on internal trade was actually implemented. And the reason was there was no real political necessity for the premiers to do it. And when we've been talking a lot in the last hour about complacency, I think this is one of them. There was no political or economic necessity to break down these barriers. I think every Canadian, once we realize how ridiculous these barriers to trade are, that I live in Calgary and I can drive 7 hours into the BC Okanagan and visit a beautiful winery. And they'll say, we can ship this wine, a case of this wine for you anywhere you live. You live in New Zealand, you live in, Zimbabwe. Oh, Calgary. No, we can't send it to Calgary 7 hours away because of these crazy barriers. And there's a lot of examples. But now we find ourselves with more economic and political, impetus to can we tear down some of these barriers? Can we actually make some headway on getting rid of a lot of these ridiculous rules and rules that are both written down and not written down, which I call sort of phantom barriers. They're a little bit harder and slipperier to identify. But can we make some headway and actually behave like one economic unit? 40 million people spread across enormous geography. Can we actually trade among our provinces as easily as we've been able to trade with the United States up until now?
Can we? So Mark Carney says he's got all the premiers to agree that by July 1st, we'll be able to do that. Do you believe it?
I think now, and I don't know if I want to give too much credit to Mr. Carney himself, but I think the conditions are right now. This is the best chance I've ever seen in the last 33 years of actually making some headway on reducing these barriers.
Maybe I'll have to dust off that report you did 33 years ago.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it's still there. I mean, it still sits there. It's all the suggestions and recommendations have not changed. But because
dust it off, we'll do an interview about it.
Yeah, because of the situation we're in, the whole elbows up and this, Canadian nationalism has been stirred. And I think the premiers actually, this is the best shot we have in the last 33 years, because now we have to take some action.
Todd, you said earlier that it's impossible to predict, but I got to ask you, 2025, is this going to be a terrible year? Are we going to have a Canadian recession? Are we going to have a global recession? Are we going to have a trade war that destroys the global economy? What's going to happen, buddy?
What is going to happen? Yeah, and I said I don't have a crystal ball. I've got a lava lamp. But if I do have to make a prediction, I do think, I don't want to sound doom and gloom. I do think the global economy is headed for some sort of recession because at the moment, it does look like the United States and China, the two largest economies on the planet, have locked themselves in an insane trade war that does not make sense, but this is just where it's been ratcheted up. I don't know. I don't foresee in the next 6 months leaders of either country, especially Donald Trump, saying, I've been wrong-headed about this the whole time. I don't know what I've been thinking. In fact, I think we are going to see more escalation, more volatility. We'll see what happens in 90 days. I guess that puts us towards the end of June. If in fact these tariffs on the other countries around the world come into place, we don't know, but we do know we are facing wild unpredictability. And because of that, I do think we are going to see a recession in 2025.
So given that, what, stay in cash? Don't invest in anything?
I don't want to give investment advice to people. That's not my role, and it really depends on the individual. For a younger person, this actually, it's kind of a cliche, but this really might present some buying opportunities with the volatility in the stock market. But as they always say, it's not timing the market; it's time in the market. So I don't want to give investment advice for people. That's up to them and their financial advisor. But I do think that everyone should be talking to their financial advisor and at least have a plan in place to weather the storm.
Weather the storm. Todd Hirsch, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it. That's been a good overview of trade, of tariffs, of free trade, of the economy, of a trade war that just doesn't make any sense, etc. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Brian. It's been great.
That's our show for tonight, everybody. Thank you for joining. I remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You could stream me online even from Calgary at www.saga960am.ca. All my podcasts and videos go up on my website and on social media and on YouTube as soon as the radio show is broadcast. Good night, everybody. Thanks, Todd.